The old man's hands trembled slightly as he held the rifle. The young officer smirked, crossed his arms, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You couldn't clear a jam with both hands. Pops. Maybe it's time to admit you don't belong here anymore." The range fell silent. Every eye turned to the elderly man in the worn red jacket, his white beard catching the afternoon light, his expression unchanging, sad and serious as always. He didn't respond. He simply closed his eyes. If you believe respect should never be measured by age, if you believe experience speaks louder than arrogance, comment honor below. His name was Thomas Brennan, and most people at the Riverside Gun Club saw only what stood before them. A 70-year-old man with weathered hands and a jacket that had seen better days, someone who shuffled rather than strode, someone whose best years seemed decades behind him. They didn't know that those same trembling hands had once moved with precision that saved lives. They didn't know that the sad, serious expression he wore like a mask concealed memories of things most people would never comprehend. They didn't know that 40 years ago Thomas Brennan had been one of the most skilled weapons instructors in the United States Marine Corps, a man who could disassemble and reassemble any firearm in conditions that would break most soldiers. But that was a lifetime ago. Now he was just an old man who came to the range on Thursday afternoons, who paid his fees quietly, who never bothered anyone, who kept to himself at the far end of the firing line. The younger members barely acknowledged him. To them, he was a relic, someone taking up space, someone who probably shouldn't even be handling firearms anymore. The trouble started 3 weeks earlier when the club announced a charity competition. Local law enforcement, military veterans and civilian enthusiasts would compete in various shooting challenges. The proceeds would go to a program supporting homeless veterans. Thomas had signed up, his signature shaky but determined on the registration sheet. When Officer Derek Mason saw the name, he laughed out loud. "You've got to be kidding me. That old guy? He can barely hold a pistol steady. This is a serious competition, not a retirement home activity." Thomas heard the comment. He always heard them. He'd been hearing variations of the same dismissal for years now, ever since age had softened his frame and silvered his hair. He never responded. What would be the point? Words meant nothing. They never had. In his world, in the world he'd come from, you proved yourself through action or you proved nothing at all. The day of the competition arrived with crisp autumn air and a crowd larger than expected. News crews had shown up. Local businesses had donated prizes. The mayor was there, shaking hands and posing for photographs. The various events were scheduled throughout the day: precision shooting, speed drills, tactical scenarios. But the main event, the one everyone wanted to see, was the malfunction clearance challenge. Competitors would be given a firearm with an induced jam, something complex and realistic, and they'd have to identify and clear it as quickly as possible under pressure. Officer Mason was the favourite. At 32, he was the department's lead firearms instructor, a position he wore like a badge of honour. He'd won regional competitions. His technique was textbook perfect. His confidence was unshakable. When he saw Thomas in the competitor lineup still wearing that faded red jacket over a plain shirt, he couldn't resist. "Hey Pops, you sure you're in the right place? The bingo hall is 2 blocks down." His fellow officers chuckled. A few spectators smiled uncomfortably. Thomas stood quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression never changing. His eyes, though sad, held something deeper, something that might have given Mason pause if he'd been paying attention. But Mason wasn't paying attention. He was too busy basking in the certainty of his own superiority. The competition began. Shooters took their turns, some clearing their malfunctions in under a minute, others struggling, fumbling, failing. Mason's turn came and he performed flawlessly. 41 seconds, smooth and efficient, every movement precise. The crowd applauded. He took a small bow, grinning. "Beat that," he said, looking directly at Thomas. When Thomas's name was called, the murmuring started immediately. People shifted in their seats. Someone whispered, "This is going to be painful to watch." Thomas walked slowly to the firing line, his gait stiff, his red jacket hanging loose on his frame. The range officer handed him the rifle, a standard AR platform with a deliberately complex malfunction, a double feed combined with a brass overbolt condition, one of the most difficult jams to clear under pressure. Thomas took the weapon. His hands, which had trembled earlier, steadied slightly as his fingers found familiar positions. He examined the rifle for a moment, his face impassive. Then he did something that made the crowd gasp. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a strip of black cloth. Before anyone could ask what he was doing, he tied it around his eyes. A blindfold, tight and secure. The range officer stepped forward, concerned. "Sir, that's not necessary. You don't have to." Thomas raised one hand slightly, a small gesture that somehow commanded attention. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear. "In Fallujah, we cleared jams in the dark, in sandstorms, under fire, with our brothers dying beside us. If I can't do it now, then I never could." The range fell absolutely silent. The timer started. Thomas's hands moved, not with the trembling uncertainty of old age, but with muscle memory so deep it transcended time itself. His fingers flew across the weapon, feeling, assessing, acting. Magazine release, lock back, extract the round, clear the chamber, tap, rack, assess. 19 seconds. The timer beeped. Thomas removed the blindfold, set the rifle down gently, and turned to walk away. The silence was deafening. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd was on its feet. But Thomas kept walking, his expression unchanged, heading back toward his spot at the edge of the range. Officer Mason stood frozen, his face drained of colour, his earlier confidence shattered like glass. That's when the black SUV pulled up. Nobody had been expecting it. The door opened and a man stepped out, tall, ramrod straight, wearing a dress uniform adorned with more ribbons and medals than most people see in a lifetime. Colonel Richard Hayes, United States Marine Corps, retired. The crowd parted as he walked directly to Thomas, who had stopped, his back still turned. Colonel Hayes's voice carried across the range, Gunnery Sergeant Brennan. Thomas turned slowly. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Then Colonel Hayes snapped to attention and rendered the sharpest salute anyone present had ever seen. Thomas, after a pause, returned it with hands that no longer trembled at all. Colonel Hayes's voice was thick with emotion. 43 years ago, this man taught me everything I know about weapons. He was the best instructor the Corps ever had. In 2 tours, he personally trained over 3,000 Marines. His techniques, his methods, they're still taught today at Quantico. He saved my life in Kuwait when my rifle jammed during an ambush, cleared it in seconds while rounds were impacting all around us. Then he handed it back to me and said, "Now you know why we train." The colonel turned to address the crowd, his eyes finding Officer Mason. This man earned 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Silver Star for valor. He was wounded 4 times. He never quit. He never complained. And when he finally retired, he did it quietly, without fanfare, because that's who he is. He doesn't need recognition. He doesn't need applause. But by God, he deserves respect. Officer Mason looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. His face had gone from white to red, shame burning across his features. He stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Sir, I didn't know. I had no idea. Thomas raised his hand again, that same small gesture. His voice was still quiet, still sad. "You didn't need to know my past to treat me with respect. You just needed to remember that everyone you meet has fought battles you know nothing about. Age doesn't erase what we were. It just changes how we carry it." The words hung in the air. Mason's eyes filled with tears. He stood at attention and saluted, a gesture Thomas accepted with a slight nod. The younger officer's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm truly sorry." What happened next surprised everyone. Thomas placed his hand on Mason's shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness that cost him nothing but meant everything. "We all have lessons to learn, son. The question is whether we're willing to learn them. Today, you learned. That makes you better than you were yesterday." The competition organisers, embarrassed and moved, immediately declared Thomas the winner. They tried to present him with an oversized cheque and a trophy. He refused both. "Give the money to the Homeless Veterans Programme. That's why we're here. Give the trophy to someone who needs the reminder of what they accomplished. I already know what I can do." But the story didn't end there. Officer Mason, shaken to his core by the encounter, requested a meeting with Thomas the following week. They met at a quiet coffee shop, away from the range, away from the crowds. Mason brought with him a notebook and a humility he'd never possessed before. He asked Thomas if he would consider teaching not just him, but the entire police department's firearms unit. "We've been doing things by the book," Mason said, "but we've forgotten that the book was written by people like you, people who learned in the worst possible conditions, who made mistakes when those mistakes cost lives, who refined techniques through necessity, not theory." Thomas considered the request for a long time, his coffee growing cold in front of him. Finally he agreed, but on one condition. "You teach your people that the weapon is just a tool. The real skill is in the mind, in the discipline, in the respect for what that tool can do. You teach them that confidence without humility is just arrogance waiting to fail. You teach them that the quiet person at the end of the line might be the most dangerous person in the room, not because they want to be, but because they've had to be." Within a month, Thomas was conducting weekly training sessions. His methods were old school, demanding, unforgiving. But they worked. Officers who had been cocky became cautious. Officers who had been careless became precise. And every single one of them learned the lesson that Mason had learned the hard way. Never judge someone's capability by their appearance. Never assume that age equals inability. Never mistake quiet dignity for weakness. The local news picked up the story. A reporter asked Thomas how it felt to be recognized after all these years. He gave her that same sad, serious look and said, "I never needed recognition. I needed purpose. Now these young officers, they're my purpose. If I can teach them something that keeps them alive, that keeps the people they protect safe, then these old hands still have value." Colonel Hayes attended one of the training sessions. Afterward, he pulled Thomas aside. "You know, Gunny, you could have told them who you were from the start. You could have put that young officer in his place immediately. Why didn't you?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the officers pack up their gear, watching them shake hands, watching them treat each other and him with genuine respect. "Because respect that's demanded isn't real," he said. "Respect that's earned, that's the only kind worth having. I didn't need to prove myself to them. I needed them to prove something to themselves." The gun club changed too. The older members, the ones who'd been dismissed or overlooked, suddenly found themselves treated differently. Younger shooters asked for advice instead of offering condescension. The club started a mentorship program pairing experienced shooters with novices. They established a wall of honor recognizing members with military or law enforcement backgrounds, not to boast, but to remember, to acknowledge the depth of experience that walked among them unnoticed. Thomas continued his Thursday afternoon range sessions, still wearing his red jacket, still maintaining that sad, serious expression. But now, when he arrived, people greeted him by name. They asked about his week. They listened when he spoke, which wasn't often, but when he did, his words carried weight. Officer Mason became one of his most dedicated students, arriving early, staying late, absorbing everything Thomas offered. The arrogance that had defined him melted away, replaced by a genuine hunger to learn, to improve, to honor the man he'd so carelessly disrespected. One evening, as the sun set over the range, Mason asked Thomas a question that had been bothering him. "Sir, that day, when you blindfolded yourself, were you trying to embarrass me? Were you trying to prove how much better you were?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "I was trying to prove something to myself, son. I was trying to prove that the things I learned, the things I survived, they weren't wasted, that I could still do what I was trained to do. Your embarrassment was just a side effect of your own assumptions. The charity competition became an annual event. Thomas never competed again, but he attended every year, watching from the sidelines, offering quiet encouragement, presenting the awards with hands that still trembled slightly, but moved with absolute certainty when it mattered. The event grew, raising more money each year, helping more veterans, building more bridges between the community and those who'd served. Years from now, long after Thomas is gone, the officers he trained will tell stories about the old man in the red jacket who could clear any malfunction blindfolded, who taught them that true skill whispers while insecurity shouts, who showed them that respect isn't about rank or age or appearance. It's about recognizing the inherent worth in every person, the battles they've fought, the wisdom they've earned, the dignity they maintain even when the world tries to strip it away. They'll tell those stories to their own students, and the lesson will continue rippling outward, touching lives that Thomas will never meet, in places he'll never go, long after his hands have finally stilled. Because that's what real legacy is, not the medals, not the recognition, not the moments of glory. It's the quiet transfer of knowledge, the patient teaching, The humble example of someone who had every reason to be bitter, but chose grace instead, who had every right to demand respect but earned it through action, who proved that the measure of a person isn't found in their youth or strength or status, but in how they treat others, how they carry their burdens, how they use what they've learned to lift up those who come after. Subscribe to my channel if you believe that everyone deserves respect regardless of age, if you believe that we should never judge someone by their appearance, if you believe that the quiet ones often have the loudest stories,